The bright studio lights beamed down on Joe Rogan as he adjusted his seat. He had done hundreds of interviews before, but something about this one felt different. Across from him sat Michael Reed, a well-known reporter famous for his aggressive style. He wasn't here for a friendly chat. He was here to challenge Joe, to make a statement, to put him on the spot. The cameras rolled, capturing every detail. The audience, both in the studio and watching live, waited in anticipation. Everyone knew Michael was going to push Joe hard, but what they didn't know was how Joe would respond. Michael smirked, leaning forward. "Joe, let's be honest here. You have one of the biggest platforms in the world. Millions listen to you, and yet you invite guests who spread dangerous ideas. Don't you think that's irresponsible?" Joe met his gaze without flinching. "Michael, my job isn't to control what people think. It's to ask questions, to have conversations." Michael scoffed. "Come on, Joe. You're not just having conversations. You're influencing people. And some of the things said on your show, well, let's just say they've caused a lot of controversy." Joe tilted his head slightly. "So, should we just stop talking about controversial topics? Pretend they don't exist?" Michael sat back, clearly enjoying the moment. "I think you have a responsibility. There's a difference between open discussion and giving a platform to dangerous ideas." The tension in the room was rising. The audience was glued to the conversation. Some nodded in agreement with Michael, while others watched Joe closely, waiting for his response. Joe leaned in slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Michael, let me ask you something. Who decides what's dangerous? You? The media? The government?" Michael opened his mouth, but Joe didn't wait for an answer. Because history is full of examples where people in power said certain ideas were dangerous, and later, we found out they were true. A murmur ran through the audience. Michael's confident smile faded for a moment, but he quickly recovered. He wasn't going to let Joe take control of the conversation. "Well, Joe," he said, chuckling, "it's easy to twist things. But the reality is, people trust you. And when you bring on certain guests, you're giving credibility to their views." Joe shrugged. "I bring on all kinds of guests, scientists, doctors, comedians, historians. Some people agree with them, some don't. That's the point of a conversation." Michael leaned forward again, his voice sharper. "But some conversations cause real harm. Some ideas mislead people. Would you bring on someone who denies basic science? Someone who spreads conspiracy theories?" Joe smirked. "I've brought on plenty of people who challenge mainstream narratives. And guess what? Sometimes they turn out to be right." Michael frowned. He hadn't expected Joe to be so confident. He had planned to make Joe stumble, to make him admit that his podcast was reckless. But Joe wasn't backing down. The audience could feel it. This wasn't just an interview. This was a battle of ideas, and it was far from over. What happened next would leave everyone stunned. Michael Reed shifted in his seat, sensing that Joe Rogan wasn't going to be easy to trap. But he wasn't done yet. He had prepared for this moment, and now it was time to turn up the pressure. With a smirk, Michael glanced at his notes, then back at Joe. "Joe, let's cut the act. You've built your career by acting like some kind of deep thinker, but let's be honest. You're just a former comedian who got lucky with a podcast." The room went silent. The insult hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Joe didn't react right away. He simply blinked, studying Michael's face. The audience held their breath. Some expected Joe to fire back with anger. Others thought he might laugh it off. But instead, he did something unexpected. He smiled. "You're right about one thing," Joe said calmly. "I was a comedian. I still am. And yeah, I started my podcast as a fun thing. But let me ask you this, Michael. If I'm so unqualified, why do millions of people listen to what I have to say?" Michael scoffed. "Because controversy sells, Joe. People love watching a train wreck." Joe chuckled. "Or maybe, just maybe, People are tired of being told what to think. Maybe they just want open conversations, something they're not getting from mainstream media. Michael's jaw tightened. Oh, please, you bring on people who push false narratives, and you don't challenge them. That's not journalism, Joe. That's reckless. Joe's expression didn't change. Michael, you're a journalist, right? You claim to search for the truth, but let's be real. How many times has the media been wrong? How many times have people like you told the public one thing, only for it to turn out false later? The audience murmured. Joe wasn't just defending himself, he was flipping the script. Michael opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say a word, Joe leaned in and delivered a line that made the entire room gasp. And in that moment, everything changed. Michael Reed's smirk faltered for the first time. He had walked into this interview confident that he could expose Joe Rogan, make him look irresponsible. But now, the conversation had taken a turn he didn't expect. Joe leaned forward, locking eyes with Michael. His voice was calm but firm. Michael, let me ask you something. If your job is to report the truth, why does the media keep getting it wrong? Michael chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, come on, Joe. Mistakes happen. But journalists work with facts. We don't just sit around and let misinformation spread unchecked. Joe nodded slowly, then glanced at the cameras. Let's test that. The audience leaned in, sensing something big was about to happen. Joe continued, remember when the media said coffee was bad for you? Then, years later, they said it was healthy. Or how about eggs? 1 year, they're dangerous. The next, they're a superfood. And don't even get me started on the so-called experts who told people that certain medications were safe, only for them to be pulled off the shelves later. Michael shifted uncomfortably. He didn't like where this was going. Joe wasn't finished. And let's talk about real people, Michael. How many times have reporters like you taken someone's words out of context? How many times have headlines misled people just to get more clicks? The audience murmured. Some nodded in agreement. Others waited to see how Michael would respond. Michael sat up straighter, trying to regain control. Joe, you're twisting things. Journalists work hard to verify information. And yes, sometimes mistakes happen, but that doesn't mean we should just allow reckless conversations to happen unchecked. Joe smirked. So your job is to decide what conversations people are allowed to have. Michael hesitated. He had walked into a trap, and he knew it. Joe continued, see, this is the problem. You call it fact-checking. I call it gatekeeping. You want to control what people hear because you're afraid of what might happen if they think for themselves. The room fell into a stunned silence. Michael's confidence was slipping, and for the first time in the interview, he had no quick comeback. Joe let the silence sit for a moment before delivering his final blow. You mock people like me for asking questions, but maybe the real question is, why are you so afraid of the answers? The audience gasped. Michael's face turned red. He had expected to humiliate Joe Rogan. Instead, he was the one struggling to defend himself. And the night was far from over. Michael Reed shifted in his chair, his confidence cracking. He had come prepared to corner Joe Rogan, to make him look careless in front of millions. But now, it was Michael who was on the defensive. Joe sat back, his expression calm but unwavering. He let his last words linger in the air, giving Michael a chance to respond. But Michael had none. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The audience could feel the tension. It was rare to see a journalist at a loss for words. Joe finally broke the silence. You see, Michael, the real problem isn't misinformation. The real problem is that people like you believe you have the authority to decide what's true and what's not. But history proves that the truth changes all the time. Michael blinked, forcing a chuckle. Joe, are you saying truth is just a matter of opinion? Facts are facts. Joe smirked. Are they? Because I can name plenty of facts that changed over time. Should I start with food, medicine, or history? Michael cleared his throat. Look, Joe, You're missing the point. The media's job is to keep people informed, to make sure they don't fall for dangerous lies. Joe raised an eyebrow. And who decides what's dangerous? You? Your bosses? The government? Michael exhaled sharply. There are experts, scientists, researchers, people who dedicate their lives to finding the truth. Joe nodded slowly. And yet those same experts have been proven wrong over and over again. If we only listen to one side, how do we ever find out the truth? Michael's jaw tightened. He could feel himself losing ground. The audience was hooked, hanging on to every word. Some nodded in agreement with Joe. Others waited to see if Michael could turn things around. Then Joe leaned in, his voice softer but sharper. You say you want people to have the facts. But what you really want is control. You want to decide what's safe to question and what isn't. That's not journalism, Michael. That's manipulation. Michael's face reddened. The cameras caught every reaction, every flicker of emotion. He knew the battle was slipping out of his hands. Joe continued, delivering the final blow. The difference between you and me. I trust people to think for themselves. You don't. Silence. The entire studio was frozen. Even the crew seemed unsure of what to do next. Michael clenched his jaw. He wasn't used to being outmatched. But tonight, he had underestimated Joe Rogan. And this conversation was far from over. Michael Reed was struggling. He had entered the interview with confidence, expecting to challenge Joe Rogan, maybe even embarrass him. But now, he was the one on the defensive, his usual sharpness fading under the weight of Joe's calm and direct responses. The audience was completely locked in. Every moment felt electric, like something big was about to happen. Michael cleared his throat, forcing a smile. Joe, you make it sound like the media is the enemy. But journalists are just doing their job, reporting facts so people don't fall for nonsense. Joe tilted his head slightly. Are they, though? Or are they just telling people what they want them to believe? Michael scoffed. Come on, that's a conspiracy theory. Joe smirked. Is it? Let's test it right now. He turned toward the audience. How many of you have ever seen a headline, believed it, and then later found out it wasn't true? The response was instant. Hands shot up across the room. Some people even murmured in agreement. Michael shifted in his seat, his smile growing tighter. That doesn't prove anything, Joe. Mistakes happen. Joe leaned forward. Mistakes or patterns? Michael exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You're twisting this whole thing. Look, misinformation is dangerous. People trust what they hear. And when someone spreads false information, real harm can happen. Joe nodded. I agree. But who decides what's false? Who gets to be the judge of what people are allowed to hear? Michael hesitated. Joe didn't give him time to recover. You say my podcast is dangerous because I allow different opinions. But maybe the real danger is when people like you decide which opinions should be silenced. The audience murmured again. Some nodded, others exchanged glances. Even those who didn't fully agree with Joe couldn't deny that he was making a strong point. Michael clenched his jaw. This wasn't how the interview was supposed to go. He had walked in expecting to dominate the conversation. Now he was struggling to hold on. And Joe Rogan wasn't done yet. With a calm, steady voice, Joe delivered the words that would shake the entire room. The real problem isn't misinformation, Michael. It's that people like you are terrified of the truth. The audience gasped. Michael's face darkened. And in that moment, the power shifted completely. Michael Reed's face was flushed now, his usual composure slipping. He had walked into this interview expecting to expose Joe Rogan as reckless, irresponsible, maybe even dangerous. Instead, he was the one struggling to keep control. Joe leaned back in his chair, watching Michael closely. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't angry. He was just waiting. The silence stretched. The audience felt it. The cameras caught every moment. Michael inhaled sharply, trying to regain his footing. Joe, Let's be real. You have a massive audience. When you spread misinformation, whether intentionally or not, it has consequences. Joe nodded. That's true. And that's why I have all kinds of people on my show. Scientists, researchers, journalists, people who challenge ideas. I don't tell people what to think. I let them hear different perspectives and decide for themselves. Michael leaned forward, trying to seize back the conversation. But some perspectives are just wrong, Joe. What if someone comes on your show and says something dangerous, something harmful? Joe shrugged, then challenged them. Prove them wrong. Isn't that how debate works? Michael opened his mouth, but Joe didn't let him interrupt. His voice was steady, calm. You see, Michael, the problem isn't that people have bad ideas. The problem is that some people think they have the right to decide which ideas get to be heard. The audience murmured again. Michael felt a surge of frustration. He had to turn this around. Joe, free speech is important, sure. But when does it cross the line? At what point do we say, enough? This is too dangerous. Joe's eyes didn't waver. When do we say it's too dangerous for people to think for themselves? Michael clenched his jaw. He knew this battle was lost. The audience knew it too. Joe sighed, almost as if he felt sorry for Michael. People aren't stupid, Michael. They don't need you, or me, to tell them what to believe. They just need the chance to hear different sides and decide for themselves. Michael had nothing left to say. The silence in the room said it all. Michael Reed sat frozen in his chair. His usual confidence had vanished, replaced by a tense silence. The audience could feel it. The interview had slipped completely out of his control. He had come here to expose Joe Rogan, but now he was the one under scrutiny. Joe let the moment stretch, his calm gaze fixed on Michael. Then, with a small sigh, he spoke. You know, Michael, the irony here is that you came on this show to prove that I'm reckless, that my platform is dangerous. He paused, letting his words sink in. But the truth is, people don't trust the media anymore, not because of me, but because of people like you. Michael flinched slightly. He tried to keep his face neutral, but the cameras caught the slight twitch in his expression. Joe continued, his voice steady. Every time the media gets caught pushing a false narrative, people lose trust. Every time a journalist manipulates a story to fit an agenda, people stop listening. And then, when they turn to someone like me, just a guy having open conversations, you call it misinformation. The audience was silent, hanging on to every word. Joe leaned in slightly. But let's be honest, Michael. The real issue isn't misinformation. The real issue is control. You don't want people thinking for themselves. You want them to believe what you tell them. Michael opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He had nothing left. Joe let the silence linger for a moment before delivering his final words. The difference between us. I trust people to figure things out for themselves. You don't. The air in the room felt heavy. Michael's face was pale, his jaw clenched. He had lost. The audience erupted, some in applause, some in stunned silence. The cameras caught it all. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a moment people would remember. Michael Reed had come to expose Joe Rogan. Instead, he had been exposed himself.